Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us for our first ever We're pumped that you decided to join us today and hang out with us. I got Clay here. He's our worship pastor at NHCC, and I'm pumped to interview him. We're going to be talking about worship today, so let's get straight to it.
Sweet.
I wanted to ask you a couple questions.
Let's do it.
I know you've been talking like, what are you going to ask me?
I know,
We're
you're
gonna
throwing
get
something at me. I'm ready. I'm so ready.
It's going to be good. So when we talk about worship, I know your heart is so big for worship. Hence the reason why you're worship pastor, right? And
there you go.
So you handle these things week in and week out at church, and I'm pumped about it. You do a great job. But I want to talk a little bit about corporate worship. So when we think about corporate worship, in my mind, the first thing I think of, obviously, a church, right? And so I want to talk to you about corporate worship and personal worship.
Totally. Cool.
So let's talk a little bit about corporate worship. What are your thoughts on that? And let's chat with him about it.
Love it. So probably one of my favorite topics in the world, obviously, right?
Yeah.
Love corporate worship, love the idea of a bunch of people coming together, gathering at the same time, at the same place, doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
And ultimately, what better could we be doing than as a bunch of believers who've had a busy week, who've had a stressful week, who've had a frustrating week, a lot of them, coming together and just letting everything reset.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I love about worship, so much more than the music, so much more than the atmosphere or whatever. It's just that idea of a bunch of people coming together and singing the same message, right?
Yeah.
To our God. And I love that.
Yeah, I think, in our day and age, we live in a very digital culture, right? You guys out there watching this right now.
Right,
it's very digital.
Go figure.
And a lot of times we see these things online, and you can hear any preacher that's absolutely amazing any Sunday you want to hear that person, right? And so what you're talking about, though, is so important that you get plugged into a local church because then you have real community and you have real fellowship. But then there's that corporate worship where you don't necessarily get online. Not that it's bad. I think it's awesome that we have the technology. Let's use it. Let's use it for God's kingdom. But there is something about going into a building and actually being in community as you're worshiping, right?
Yep.
So when you talk about that, like being together, all of us in one location, what do you think stirs up in our hearts? Like what does that actually look like?
Man, it does so much for us, and like all throughout the New Testament, it talks about unity of the church, and it talks about the unity of believers, and it even mentions specifically, coming together and singing hymns, singing these spiritual songs, and it's
clashing
so cool.
Clashing
of cymbals,
that's drums, baby.
Stuff, all
that's
of
drums.
It's in there. I see it, right? But it's that idea of that unity of people, right? And like you said, it stirs something up in us, and it stirs something up in people, and we're able to, when you take a worship song, whatever the topic of that worship song is, whether it be a hymn, or whether it be even a psalm, or something that's more modern, something that's been recently written, we're singing this topic, and we're proclaiming that thing together, and I think that ties people together.
Absolutely.
And
I love it.
You don't feel like you're away from, you're a part of something bigger than yourself in worship, and I that's huge.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talk about corporate worship. Let's move on to personal worship, because I think a lot of times you hear the word worship, you think church, you think in a building with other people, right? Corporate worship.
Yep.
But I think there's obviously a bigger aspect to worship. And so what does that look like to you when you think personal worship? What does that mean? Can we worship every day? Can we worship in what we do? Can you speak to that a little bit?
The reality is we do worship every single day. We worship every second. We're constantly worshiping something.
Yeah.
It's just more the question is what?
Yeah.
What are we worshiping?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And our goal as believers is that we're worshiping God, right? In every single thing that we do. And that's the idea. But every single move that you make, every single word that you say points your life towards something. And I think it's so key to make sure that is what I'm doing at my job or at my house or hanging with my kids or hanging with my spouse or whatever I'm doing, is that thing pointing me and pointing others to Jesus? Or is it pointing to something else? Because that's what I'm worshiping.
Yeah. I think you highlighted on a key thing, and that is like you can worship in your job, you can worship in your family, you can worship in everything God's given you, right? Because obviously He's a creator of all things. Right. He created all things. And so we have all these things because of Him. And in return, we give it back to Him, and that's a sense of worship, right? Going, it's all yours, Lord. So this is it. And I love that you speak to that, because I think a lot of times people think, well, I can't really, how do I worship at work? And how do I think? It's what are we doing it for, right? What do we go to work for? Well, obviously provide for family, but also we do it to glorify God. He told us, get to work, provide. Right. So it's a really key thing.
Yeah, well, and it's that Romans 12 thing, right? Yeah. It's you presenting your bodies as a living sacrifice, right? Every single day. So when you're living, when you're breathing, when you're doing everything that you do throughout your day, is it that constant living sacrifice, right?
So true. I think, again, I hope you guys are encouraged to hear that, because it's not just the worship leader, that's in worship. It's those in the room, filling the room, but then outside of that, I think, again, as we talk about worship, it's a way that we preach the gospel.
Right.
It's a way that we actually live a life of Jesus, because we're pumped and we're excited. Right. But people can see what we're worshiping. Yeah. What's that number one thing in your life? They know what it is. They know what that number one thing is. Yep. And so that's what you're sharing with them, is that's what I'm focused on. So that's what I'm worshiping. Yeah. And so I hope you're encouraged to say, look, in all that you do, we can worship the Lord. All that we do, we can point all the glory and praise to Jesus. Right. So be encouraged by that. And I hope is that you guys have a week or whatever that's ahead, is everything you do, you can worship in that towards God.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us. Again, this is Clay, Pastor Clay of NHCC. I'm Pastor David. Have a great week. Hey guys, make sure you like
and subscribe
so that way you don't miss any upcoming videos.